So, if you've been baffled by President Biden saying that he won't negotiate with Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy on the debt ceiling, but then nonetheless meeting with Kevin McCarthy and other congressional leaders on the debt ceiling, then you are not alone. Now, to be clear, Democrats said that what happened in the White House on Tuesday was not a negotiation, it was rather a talk or conversations. So today, I'm going to break down what's happening in the quote unquote negotiations between House Republicans and the White House over raising the debt ceiling limit. So let's start with the first conundrum. Despite the fact that the Biden administration has said that they are not negotiating with Republicans in Congress over raising the debt ceiling, I want to tell you that what happened last Tuesday in the Oval Office was the beginning of a negotiation. Why is that? Because a negotiation is any communication between two or more persons to influence or to persuade. And what happened in that meeting that Democrats are calling a conversation or talks was actually an attempt to persuade. It was partially an attempt to persuade the Republicans, Senator McConnell and Speaker of the House McCarthy, who showed up at the White House, but it was partially an attempt to persuade the American public generally that the Democrats are being reasonable on these issues and the Republicans are being crazy, unhinged, or unreasonable. So let me give you a little bit more context here. Right now, by June 1st, if the U.S. Congress does not increase the debt ceiling limit, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen will say that the United States does not have enough money to pay bills that we already have incurred. So, first issue here, why is the White House saying there's no negotiation here? They're saying there's no negotiation because they're saying that what we should do is have what they call a clean bill, meaning that the Congress should raise the debt ceiling limit because these are debts that the United States Congress has already incurred because of past budgets passed. And so what the White House is saying is linking this raising of the debt ceiling to otherwise cutting the budget or any other issues is illegitimate. It's inappropriate, and the White House is saying, we won't do it. What they're saying is you need to, Republicans, simply pay your bills, just the way every household in the United States needs to pay its bills. Now, Republicans have a different view on this. They have said it is completely appropriate to condition lifting the debt ceiling on cuts to the budget. And in fact, what the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, has said is, we Republicans, have already agreed to lift the debt ceiling because, in fact, we, unlike the Democrats, have actually passed out of the House a bill that would raise the debt ceiling. And that is, in fact, true. But of course, in that bill are literally cuts that would completely eliminate the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Now, just to put this into context, Janet Yellen, and it's not just our Treasury Secretary, but pretty much every economist has said that if the United States defaults on its debt, this will lead to global economic calamity. So in other words, we will plunge ourselves by our own negotiation ineptitude into a major recession, probably costing hundreds of thousands of jobs and probably putting at risk the reality of the United States as being the global reserve currency. In other words, if the United States can't even pay its own bills, the rest of the world will say, why is the US dollar the global reserve currency? It makes no sense. And so the implications of this for the average American are extremely profound. Consequently, pretty much everyone, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, everyone agrees that default on our loans must be prevented. In fact, on Tuesday, Republican Minority Leader Senator Mitch McConnell said that the United States has never and will not now default on its debt. So let me put a little bit more context on this, because in fact, the Biden administration has expressed a willingness to discuss cuts on the budget. But they have said that those discussions should be in negotiations and should happen on the merits of the budget, and that what should not happen is that this discussion should be linked to lifting the debt ceiling. Republicans, on the other hand, have said, listen, Democrats, you are not trustworthy. We don't believe that if we lift the debt ceiling, that we will actually have a legitimate conversation about budget cuts. And that's why we are linking these two things. So, of course, from a negotiation perspective, the big problem here is a problem that happens so often in negotiations, which is that there's a lack of trust between the parties. Democrats are basically saying, evil Republicans, you are using the reputation of the United States to be a payer of bills as a hostage issue in this negotiation. And Republicans are saying, this is the only leverage we have. If we don't use it, we will never get a serious negotiation on budget cuts. So all of this brings us to the big question, right? What to do here? So here's where we're at. From a negotiation perspective, we are in the worst possible situation, like the nightmare situation, which is a game of chicken. The way this is currently set up is the entire reputation of the United States as a responsible country that pays its bill has been reduced to this situation of whether the Republicans or the Democrats will blink first. This is a place you never want to be in a negotiation. What is the current consequence here? Well, if Speaker McCarthy blinks and somehow caves and says to the president, we will allow a clean bill to go forward, there's a fair likelihood that he will lose his speakership. And the reason why is that there are some radical Republicans who will actually call a vote on his speakership. And because the Republican majority in the House is so narrow, it is almost certain that McCarthy will no longer be Speaker of the House. On the other hand, if Biden decides to negotiate cuts as part of an increase of the debt limit, he will necessarily look weak. He will look like someone who isn't following through on his commitments. So both sides are trapped. Now, what is a second possible way forward? So a second possible way forward is for the parties to look to their BATNA. Now, the BATNA for the Speaker is not very good, but the BATNA for the White House might be better than it seems. For those of you new to my channel, let me remind you about what we mean by BATNA. BATNA is our best alternative to a negotiated agreement. In other words, if we don't reach an agreement with the other side, what can we do that does not require an agreement with them? And the White House is now considering a novel argument which would rely on the 14th Amendment and allow the White House to simply direct the Secretary of the Treasury to pay the bill, even though it is above the debt ceiling limit established by Congress. So what is this phrasing in the 14th Amendment? So here's the quote. The 14th Amendment says this, quote, "The validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellion, shall not be questioned." So the argument here is that all of the bills that the United States has been authorized by law because the debts are pursuant to budgets passed by Congress. Therefore, that debt cannot be questioned, and therefore the president, even without an authorization of Congress, has the right to order Yellen to pay it. Now, if he does this, what will happen is that Republicans, in particular Speaker McCarthy, will be faced with a pretty bad choice. One is to just let this happen, and then he ends up looking weak. The other is to initiate a lawsuit against the White House, suggesting that this unilateral action is unconstitutional. But of course, then McCarthy is in this strange situation where he is suing the president for authorizing payment of legitimate debts. This is not a great look for McCarthy. Moreover, this argument is actually unlikely to persuade even a pretty conservative Supreme Court. If you look at the justices, it's pretty clear that at least 5 of them would say, no, the president has the authority to pay these bills. The third possible outcome, which is probably the worst, is that in fact, the parties don't agree, and the United States defaults. And if the United States defaults, what will happen is we will go into a recession, hundreds of thousands of jobs will be lost, and then we will probably end up with what we call a mutual hurting stalemate. In other words, we will have inflicted a wound on ourselves so bad that probably both parties will come to the table because there will be a demand from the American people. But this will be a catastrophic result. What would be a better result? So I think we have something on the table here. In fact, if President Biden could commit to Speaker McCarthy that there will be serious negotiations at a date certain following a clean budget, and that he could put his credibility as the president this will happen, this should give Speaker McCarthy enough cover to pass a clean bill raising the debt limit. In addition, on Tuesday, President Biden did put a little bit forward to give McCarthy just a little bit more of a yesable proposition. Because even though the president said, I'm not prepared to negotiate, he did say that he would be willing to allow what he called a clawback on coronavirus funding that has yet to be used. So this would amount to probably about $40 to $50 billion that was allocated by Congress, but that hasn't been spent. And it would at least give McCarthy the fig leaf to say, I got something out of this, as well as a guarantee to negotiate budget cut issues down the road. The only way forward here is that both sides have to actually lower the rhetoric and this is importantly, focus on common interests. And the reality is that for the interests of the American people, it is essential that we raise the debt ceiling in order to pay our debts. So I hope this tutorial enlightened you a little bit about where we're at in these negotiations. If you're ready to move from the domestic negotiation to the international negotiation arena, watch this next video on the Chinese spy balloon over the US. And before you leave, please subscribe to my channel, like this video, and ring the bell so that you never miss a new video. Okay, we don't need a bill. We don't need to pass a law for you to keep watching. Click, click.